This presentation covers traditional ways of preserving food and why they work. Now you may be wondering, why are we covering this in a human microbiome course? Because it ties into your microbiome. Of course! I like to give an overview of what we're going to talk about. So we're going to discuss historically why we want to preserve food. Then we're going to talk about drying, salting and smoking, temperature, fermentation, and then I'm going to do a big old wrap-up. So this part, going over a historical overview of food preservation, may seem kind of silly, but I'm going to go over it anyway. So from my cultural background, the main reason to preserve food is that we have winter. And then during winter you can't grow crops, and it's generally a time when it's harder to go hunting and fishing as well. So during the summer you've got to get your food, and then somehow you've got to get it to last through the winter. In other parts of the world they are also concerned about food preservation. Even though they don't have a cold season, they do have wet and dry seasons alternating, and so you still have to have some way of getting your food that when you first pick it is juicy and lush and wonderful, and after a few days looks like this and is completely inedible, to survive during the times when you can't grow food. So let's move on to drying, which is one of the simplest ways of preserving your food. So I've got some examples of some dried onions and grapes and parsley and peppers, all of which you may be familiar with. So drying, quite simply, is removing the water. So why does removing water help to preserve food? Well, let's look at what's happening on a cellular level. This is my eukaryotic cell, which plants are eukaryotes, and most of what we're drying is plant material. But we also dry meats, and here is my bacterium that wants to eat my food before I do. So inside of my eukaryotic cell, I have a balance between water and salts and carbohydrates and other macromolecules. Now my bacterium has approximately the same concentration, but what I'm going to do through the process of drying is I'm going to remove the water, and I'm going to turn my cell, turn it into a raisin. Whether it's actually a grape or not, we have a tendency to call different dried food items different things, but in any case we're going to remove the water, and my concentrations of salts and carbs within the remaining cell is going to go up, and it's going to be too concentrated for this bacterium to be very happy with growing on. And if it were inside of this cell, water would be removed from it as well, because water wants to go toward the higher concentration of salts and carbs, and this poor little cell would turn into a raisin too. What it does, generally speaking, instead is it hangs out saying, I'm going to wait for things to get moist again before I start eating and reproducing. So it's just kind of hanging out. And I can rehydrate my food when I need it and eat it, and it still tastes good and it's not spoiled. So let's talk about salting and smoking. Actually, under the category of salting, I'm going to include putting a lot of carbs into your food item, so jams and jellies as well as salt fish and that kind of thing. So when you increase the concentration of salts and carbs outside of the cells, the water wants to move toward the higher concentration of salts and carbs, moves out of the cells, and both my bacteria and my eukaryotic food cells become raisins. So this kills some of the bacteria. Some are able to resist this osmotic action, the movement of water out of the cells, and so once again they just kind of hang out. So smoking is kind of a combination between drying and salting, and oftentimes we combine that with adding sugar and adding salt, because you're removing water from your food item, you're adding smoke, which makes it quite tasty, but also you're getting antimicrobial compounds that are coming into the food that prevents the growth of the bacteria. On to temperature. When you think of temperature, you probably think of heat, by either boiling something or through dry heat, roasting things, cooking it over an open fire. Heat preserves food because it denatures proteins. It causes the protein structure to become unraveled, and it no longer functions how it should. This kills bacteria and fungus that may be in the food, and it also breaks down the proteins in the food and makes it tender and more tasty. Now, another consideration for temperature that I want you to think about is cold. In climates where there is a cold season, oftentimes food would be put outside or in a cold house so that food would stay cold. Now, cold doesn't denature proteins, it doesn't unravel them, but it does slow down their action, and basically the bacteria and fungus that are competing with us to eat our food basically goes to sleep for the winter, and so they don't grow and they don't spoil our food. Now for the last traditional method that I'm going to talk about, which is fermentation. Now there's lots of different kinds of fermentation. The two you're probably most familiar with are the kind that produces alcohol and the kind that produces yogurts and cheeses and that kind of thing. For this presentation, I'm going to focus on lactic acid fermentation because lactobacilli are part of the human microbiome. So here's my lactobacillus, and it's in a food item. We'll say that it's in milk, and there's a whole bunch of other bacteria that could spoil the milk or cause food poisoning. So they're all eating, they're all reproducing, but my lactic acid bacteria is producing an awful lot of lactic acid. That's why we call them lactic acid producing bacteria. And as the pH drops, as the milk becomes more acidic, these other bacteria are going to be less happy and they're not going to reproduce as much. Whereas my lactic acid bacteria are going to reproduce and take over the culture. This preserves the food because we as humans don't get sick when we eat lactic acid producing bacteria. And then when we eat a fermented food, it gets into our gut and helps maintain our healthy microbiota because these guys do the same thing within us. And as they produce acid within our gut and our reproductive tract, it keeps down numbers of potential pathogens. Isn't that wonderful? Makes you want to run out and go eat some yogurt or lacto-fermented pickles and sauerkraut. Now, I do have to mention that most pickles and sauerkraut nowadays are made with vinegar, which is another fermentation product, because it's a more controlled way of fermenting cucumbers and cabbage. But there has been a resurgence of doing your own lacto-fermentation, of which you're going to be reading some about during this week. So to wrap up this presentation, we preserve food to prevent food spoilage and to inhibit pathogen growth, and oftentimes we increase the nutrients within the food, especially when you're talking lacto-fermentation, of which I've got examples of with homemade sauerkraut and yogurt, and it also improves the flavor of the foods. And I want you to keep these things in mind as we talk about food safety, and think about how the different types of food preservation methods can help or hinder your microbiome, specifically your pet.